It's a great idea. Okay, we are up to Daf Yud Tet Amud Aleph, and if you're following in the art scroll, we are up to 19a3. We had a very long Mishnah, where the Mishnah actually is in the Mishnayot. It's actually divided into a bunch of different Mishnayot, but in the Gemara they kept it all together. So we had a very long Mishnah, and now the Gemara is basically going to parse that Mishnah and break it into its component parts. Says the Gemara, Seder Taniyot ha'elu ha'amur. Right? We started off by saying that these Taniyot, when do they apply? They apply when the first rain, we missed the date. B'Riviyah Rishona. Viramini, the Gemara asks us, 1 second, the Braita tells us, Riviyah Rishona, Ushniya Lish'ol, right? The first one that's missed, and the second one that's missed, Lish'ol, we pray. Shlishit, but if we miss the third cutoff date, the third red line, yani, then we start fasting. Indicating, though, that missing the first one or the second one is not enough to start a fast. And in our Mishnah it says, Seder Taniyot ha'elu ha'amur b'Riviyah Rishona, when we miss the first one. Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Yehuda answers, Hachika Amar. Seder Taniyot ha'amur ematai. When did we do this? When did we have this, the Taniyot? Bizman she'yatzah Riviyah Rishona v'Shna v'Shishit. The first and the second and the third. But we just said the first. So what does it mean? How are you sticking that into the words of the Mishnah? Sorry, so what does it mean when it says V'lo yadu gishamim? The Gemara's answer is, it means the first rains. It doesn't mean only the first rain, it means the first rains. Because there's another rain that comes after the first three, which is the fourth rain, and that fourth rain has another name. So the first rains are missed. That's when we declare these ta'aniyot. Now the Gemara continues and says, the Mishnah continues and says, Lo yadu gishamim, avayaru gishamim, but gishamim fell b'riviyah rishona in one of these first three times. V'zaru v'lo tzamechu, and the people planted, but it didn't grow. Or inami tzamechu v'chazru v'nishtanu, or if they already planted and they grew, v'chazru v'nishtanu, but they grew in a strange way, like we described already last time. Matri'ina lehem yad, we immediately jump in with the strict fasts. The Mishnah then says, 1 second, what does this mean? That they grew in a not normal way. Amar Rav Nachman, dafka nishtanu, if they changed, aval yavshu lo, but if they dried out, then the halacha is not that we would intervene with a fast immediately. The Gemara asks, 1 second, why is the differentiation between if it grew in an abnormal way or if it dried out? The Gemara says, Pshita, nishtanu tenan, it says in the Mishnah, nishtanu, that they would change, that they grew differently. It doesn't say, if it meant yavshu, then it would have said yavshu. So why do I need Rav Nachman to come tell me that the Mishnah means nishtanu, but not yavshu? That is literally the word of the Mishnah. The Gemara says, no, lo tzaricha, the akun, where the crops they grew. So even though it was dried out, but it grew more. So you might think that the fact that it grew more already tells me that it's not as serious as I would have thought. So therefore, I don't have to do anything. Kamash balan, no, that growth actually is not important. Now, there's two ways to understand what the Mishnah over here is telling us. One way is to say that that the growth that you're seeing is actually not going to help, and therefore we don't pray because it's no point to pray. It's not going to get better, right? So there's a halacha that you can't pray, as we already said, on something that's already a foregone conclusion. You can't pray, as an example, that a baby boy at the advanced stage in the pregnancy is going to be a baby girl. You can't pray for a girl or a boy after 40 days, because whatever it is already is.
If it's dried, it's too late then?
So what he's saying is that if it's dried, even if it continues to grow on a stalk level, it doesn't matter. That's just, it's foregone conclusion. This thing is dying. It's not going to help to pray. The other opinion is, no, it's not. You don't need to pray in that situation. So on either scenario, we're interpreting it a little bit differently, depending on which way you're going in the Gemara. Either it means yaveshu, you wouldn't pray because you don't need to pray, or yaveshu means you don't pray because it won't help. Okay, but in either case, the Gemara says nishtanu it means that they changed and they grew in a different or in an abnormal way. Maybe where it grew a stalk without the kernels, as an example. The Gemara now discusses, what do we do? The next part of the Mishnah. What happens if we had a first rain, and then the rain, after the first rain gets delayed a period of 40 days, in the second rain, or the third rain? So the Gemara ends off, it doesn't actually say this in the Gemara, but the Gemara is expecting you to remember the words of the Mishnah that we just read, where the Mishnah actually says, what happens if it paused in the rain for a significant amount of time, and the Gemara over there said we have to go the extra mile. Why? Because it's considered a batzoret, makat batzoret. Okay, so the Gemara says, what do you mean? Why is this makat batzoret? Makat batzoret means a plague of batzoret, where there's a shortage of food, where there's a famine. The fact that something doesn't rain doesn't create famine, right? Gemara says that's true. We don't mean a situation has to deteriorate to such a radical degree that there's already a famine. But what we mean is that when there's that little rain, where there's a dearth of rain of 40 days after that first rain, the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, Makah mavi'ah lidei batzoret. So the Gemara is clarifying that you have food on the shelves. Someone's going to ask, why, if the Mishnah says it's a makat batzoret, it's a famine? Look, it's not a famine. It's only been 40 days. The Gemara is answering that the knock-on effect of that little rain in an agricultural society like they had in Israel at the time created makah mivi'ah lidei batzoret. It was the beginning stages, and therefore we set it down already from then. Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman taught now. So we're now just expressed this concept of makah mevi'ah lidei batzoret, or a full-fledged famine. Amar Rav Nachman, how do you tell the difference? How do you know what the Chachamim classified as the beginning stages, the later stages? Amar Rav Nachman, nahara, river to river, bitzorta. That's a food shortage. That's a small amount. We're running out. Midinata kafna. When the food is somewhere else, but it requires transportation. In the times of old, a river was the symbol of transportation, of moving something from one place to the other. So nahara, that's considered batzorta, a shortage. But midinata, but if you need to transport food from another country, it's not just sending it down the river, that's already considered a famine. I think there's another way of learning the Gemara over here, where the Gemara is actually referring to the rain itself. So if we've run out of rain, but we can divert rain from one nahar to one river to another river, so the water is still available. When that's no longer an option, and we need to literally be transporting water from another place. I remember there were times of a shortage of water in Israel that was so intense that other countries were shipping water, like containers of water, bottles of water, to Israel, and vice versa. Israel at the time was shipping to Turkey, which we never should have done. They all should have. All right.
Now we give to Jordan.
And now we give to Jordan, exactly. All right. V'amar Rav Hanina. Rav Hanina said, Sa'a b'sela ushchicha. So if, as an example, a person has, we go to the marketplaces or to Amazon, and you see that the price of a sa'a, a measurement of wheat, there's one sela, but there's still enough wheat accessible, so it's expensive but accessible. That's considered batzorta. But arba velo shchicha. But if the price goes up to 4 se'ah for a sela, but it's not the wheat, so in other words, even if it's cheaper, so 4 se'ah for a sela, so it's actually not so expensive as compared to the higher price. But you can't get it, so then kafna. Then at that stage, we're literally looking at a famine. You're looking at something which is a famine. Now, I wonder what economists would say to this Gemara.
Yeah, there's inflation.
Right? What do you mean? If it's not accessible,
Supply and demand.
Supply and demand. So if you can't get it, so then what does it mean that there's four for a seller? How could such a thing be? So actually, it's quite an interesting thing. There's in finance, what this reminded me of is in finance is a concept of a market correction, right? Or when they realize that a stock is overpriced. There are times when supply and demand actually doesn't catch up with the price fast enough. So there's the price in the shuk, right? But we haven't yet realized that we're actually days away from nothing, and then the price eventually corrects. But what the Gemara, I believe, over here is talking about is before a market correction, where things are, where things are not yet priced at their true, according to their true rarity. Okay, let's carry on. The alternate explanation I had for the Gemara is that there's a lot of wheat, so wheat is still inexpensive, but you can't get it. So in other words, people are starting to hoard it. So it's not expensive because you can't get it. The scarcity is artificial, but that's always a sign that there's a larger famine coming in its wake. Okay, let's carry on. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo shanu. When do we give this barometer for something being called a famine? Lo shanu ele bizman shamaot bizol uperot biyoker. This is only true when there's enough money in the economy. People have a lot of money, okay? But the food, the food is what's expensive. Aval ma'ot biyoker. But what happens when the money is expensive and the perot bezol, right? So matrin aleh miyad, because even if the price of the thing is low, people don't have access to money. So what would the Gemara say if it had Biden's time, where money is expensive to borrow and the price of food is very expensive? Hard to know what the Gemara was. I assume we would declare many fasts. Okay, matrin aleha miyad. We cry out immediately, because again, even if there's not a scarcity of fruit, if there's a scarcity of money, then people don't have access even to inexpensive food. De Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Yochanan taught, Nehirna kad havu kayame dalid sa'in besela. He says, I remember there was a time when actually that amount, that concept of 4 sa'ah to a sela, we need another Gemara, where you have 4 ahalan usahalan, where you have 4 sa'ah to a sela, v'havi nefichi kafan b'tveria medelet isar. But there were so many people in the city that he lived, whose bellies, their stomachs, they started to swell from the fact that there was no food and they had no money to be able to buy it. So in other words, there's food in the marketplace, but the people don't have the money to buy it. So Rabbi Yochanan is telling you, I remember such a scenario. This actually takes place. So you see from their actual physical characteristics, people were starving to death. There was food in the marketplace, but they didn't have the money to buy it. The Gemara now continues. So then that would be a time, obviously, that would be worthy of declaring the strictest of fasts. The Gemara continues. What happens if enough food, there's a plug here, right there in the middle, on the floor. What happens if the rain came down for the crops, the vegetables, the bushes, but not for the trees? Or, as we said actually earlier, if you remember, or if it fell for the crops and the trees, but not for the ditches, not for the reservoirs. If you tell me it fell for the crops, but not for the trees, that happens, right? When you get a little bit of rain, but you don't get a lot, the trees drink more water, so that's the case that it happens. But a scenario, le'ilan velo letzemachim, I can also understand, as we said, that it rains for trees but not for the crops. Why? Because it rains so much, where it rains a lot but not gently, where the trees, the vegetables and the plants, they get flooded by the excess rain. So that could also be a problem. How could that happen? When does that happen? Mashkachat ta'azia razia v'nicha. Right? So where is the case where it fills up for the plants and for the trees and not for the reservoirs? So the Gemara says that case happens, right? When it rains, the rain's heavy. You had a heavy rain, you had a light rain, but miutuva lo atya. It didn't rain that much that it was able to fill up all the reservoirs. And still, we're worried about that because we need all of the water in the reservoirs for drinking water and for the bathing water, for everything else. Tanya, but we have a brighter that says yardu leborot u'sechinu me'arot, avalo lezeh ulazeh. But if it rained for the reservoirs and for the trees and for the ditches and for the holes in the ground, but not for the ilan and for the tzemachim, how could such a case ever be relevant? If you had enough to fill up that, then you had enough to give, at least for the trees. Never mind for the crops, because we already said maybe they get ruined. The Gemara says, the atya b'shfichuta. It comes down with a tremendous amount of rain in a very small amount of time. So the rain fills up the reservoirs, but actually for the crops and the trees it doesn't work. Now, I actually learned this past summer. I don't know if you remember. They kept talking about how it rained and rained and rained, and then we had a storm. So remember they kept talking about the saturation level? So immediately as it started to rain in the summer, if you remember, it started flooding, like within minutes. Yeah, because the water in the ground was literally up to the top, right? So you have a situation where the water, the rain, the earth gets so saturated that it can't actually take in any more water. So when rain comes with such a tremendous amount, so if rain falls slowly, it seeps in the ground. But when rain falls that hard, what happens? It rains so hard it doesn't actually get into the earth. It just starts creating a stream and it moves on the top, at the top of the water. It's to do as well, by the way, with the nature of the viscosity of the water and the flow. So when rain falls slowly enough, it gets absorbed. When rain falls so fast that there's like a river on top of the water pulls the water away before it has a chance to go in. And the water molecules stick to one another faster than the earth can dissolve the water molecule to swallow it up.
You have that a lot in Bal Yehuda. For the first rain, if it rains
exactly.
very long, it just does it. Since you've been
it
after
kills
summer,
people die. Every summer, people die in Midbar Yehuda because it just starts to rain. The earth is not yet swallowed any of the water, so it's like and it's so much water comes that it creates these like instantaneous torrential floods, and it sweeps away families, cars. It comes across the highway.
Mudslides?
No, it's water. It's just pure water. But there's so much of it, and the ground is not yet softened enough to take the water in, that it's as if the water was raining on a hard surface.
Wow.
Okay? And literally it happens every summer. I remember there's actually signs where there's these roads on the way down to Eilat past the Dead Sea, where you see there's like the water has carved out like a space between the mountains, and it's all desert. And you're driving on this little road that's crossing in between where those mountains open. And there's signs there. Beware, because you don't think about it because it's so arid and it's literally in the middle of the desert. But when it rains like that and the waters come down, in a matter of minutes, if you're not off the road, you're gone. Literally, people die every summer. But Minan, we should not hear such news. Okay. The Gemara now continues. When did we have situations like this? Tanu Rabbanan. The rabbis taught the example in the Braita. Matri'in ala ilanot bifros haPesach. Right? When Pesach, when we've reached the time of Pesach, and the trees have not yet got enough rain for what they need, so Matri'in will cry out, will institute these stringent fasts. At the time of Pesach, we know we're already supposed to be seeing the first fruits come out. That's when we make Birkat Ilanot. The fruits flower, and you start seeing the emergence of the perot of the fruit themselves. So if at that stage they haven't had water, we're really way behind. Ala borot u'sichin me'arot b'fros hachag. At what stage are we worried about the reservoirs not being full? B'fros hachag, when Sukkot comes by. Why? Because again, remember, by Sukkot time, where are we holding in the calendar? You're already towards the end of the summer, right? You're heading into the fall. At that period, we would expect all the rains to have fallen and filled it up. Ve'al kulan im en lahem mayim nishtot. But in any scenario, at any date, if there's not water to drink, if people are literally rationing water to drink, then we already matri'in alehem miyad. We immediately declare this. Ve'ezu miyad shelahem. What does that mean? Where we say immediately, right? We keep saying that word miyad. We immediately call out the fasts. What is that halacha? Halacha is sheni v'chamishi v'sheni. We do Monday, Thursday, Monday, otherwise known as Bahab. What does Bahab mean? Not bet, hey bet. It's an abbreviation, okay? Ve'al kulan, and on all of these cases, en matri'in alehem, we do not call out for them, ela be'afarchia shelahem. Only in the area, in the country that is being affected, all right? Where there's a lack of rain, or the trees should have had it by Pesach, or the ditches should have been full by Sukkot. We deal with that specific country, right? Ve'askira, what happens if a person sees or they witness that there's a terrible plague that's flowing through the area called askira? Very appropriate.
COVID-like.
When do we have askira, by the way? One of the opinions is that the students of Rabbi Akiva died in askira, in this plague. So Lag BaOmer right now, we're having you can see they're preparing for the Hilulah upstairs. So what happens with askira? Bizman sheyesh b'mita, when it causes death, there's askira that causes people to just get sick. I guess depends on the variant, okay? Askira as a plague. Now, if you look carefully, I want to show you something even more interesting. Look down at number 16 in the notes. Yeah, you see that? Yeah. Whereby the throat is constricted, causing difficulty in breathing. How much does that sound like what we're going through? All right? So, in a case where this plague is going to cause actual death, what if people are not dying from it? Then we don't call out for it. Now, if you find a scenario with a specific kind of arbe, of locusts, of grasshoppers that were called the govai locusts, in such a case, even if we see any of them, we're terrified because when they come hardcore. Okay? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Afal hechagav. Also on chagavim, the same halacha applies. It's another kind of locust where if we see a few, we already know that it's going to be a disaster and we'll already decree a fast. The Gemara continues. Tan Rabbanan, matri'in ala ilanot. We call out on if there's not enough rain for the trees. B'sha'ar shnei shavua, during any year in the cycle of years, except for Shemitah. Why? Because if it's a time of Shemitah, there's no one who owns those fruit trees, and therefore they're not part of the economic cycle. Now, one would imagine...
For the poor people.
Sorry?
How about for the poor people?
So the poor people eat other things. We're talking about if it's specifically trees.
Okay.
Now, obviously, if there's a society that's relying on the trees for their baseline food, of course, we would call a fast. Why? Because if you remember, one of the elements is a lack of rain decided by the crops, the trees, etc., etc. But one of the things is when there's a famine, if they're relying on the trees for a famine, if they're relying on the trees for food, and the trees are out of commission, we would call a fast because it's a famine, not because the trees don't have enough rain. So we're saying over here is if the trees don't have enough rain in the year of Shemitah, but you don't need them to actually eat, we would declare a fast on them if there are owners involved. Why? Because for those people, that's their parnasah, and we have to make sure that they're covered. In the year of Shemitah, when anyway it's not their parnasah, we would not call out to make a fast.
But this only applies for in Eretz Israel. It's Shemitah doesn't apply to Chutz La'aretz.
Sorry?
This only applies in Eretz Israel.
Correct.
Shemitah.
Correct. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer says, Maris, afali lanot b'shvi'it, also on the trees in Shvi'it, mipnei sheyesh ben parnasa la'aniyim. Because even though, now again, look carefully, he doesn't say that's the food for the poor. If not that, they're starving. Because again, same reason. If we're at a situation where people don't have food, then we're fasting because there's a famine. But he's saying the same way you worry during the other years because they use this for their parnasa, a poor person who goes in and takes that fruit is now, he can use that fruit not only to eat but for parnasa. He could sell that apple and buy clothes. He could sell that apple, buy something else. Right? So therefore, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that even in such a case, even during years Shemitah, we would declare a fast for lack of rain for the trees. Gemara continues. Tanya idach. We have another braita. Matri'in ala ilanot. Right? We call out for ilanot b'shar shnei shavua. All the other years, except for Shemitah. Ala borot ala sichin ala me'orot. Afilu b'shvi'it. On the reservoirs of water, even on Shvi'it. Right? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Af ala ilanot matri'in. We call out ala sfichin b'shvi'it. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, even on the trees, and that is in lockstep with the braita that we just said, because he's worried about them it being the parnasah of the poor people. Matri'in ala sfichin b'shvi'it. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel continues and says, not only on the trees, but even on the extra plant growth, so the stuff that grows beyond what people are planting domestically. So wild plants or stuff that kind of comes that after the harvest. In each of these scenarios, he plays. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says anything basically which is at risk, any food, fruit, plants which is at risk, which the aniyim are using to make up their parnasah, so we'll pray for them, we'll fast for the aniyim because we're worried about their parnasah. Yes.
Matri'im means what?
Matri'im means we call.
shofar?
So we've already said the word matri'im can mean both. Calling out. It's here used as the calling out, the extra special prayers that they would add on a stringent fast. But the Gemara is going to describe exactly what we mean. We've already had that matri'im means not just call out in prayer, because the Gemara was mechalek earlier, if you remember. It said on a sfina, on a boat, on Shabbat, that he could call out privately, but not exactly. You could call to help us, but you can't call out. The other opinion was they could call out privately, but they don't arrange a public, yelling of to Shamayim, because that's not what we're supposed to do on Shabbat. So you see again that the word matri'in refers to a public calling out, which is involved with the fast. Tanya, the Braita says, Amar Rabbi Eliezer ben Pirata. Rabbi Eliezer ben Pirata used to say, Yom shechar Beit HaMikdash, from the time Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Nasu gshamim tzimukim le'olam. The rains were, it's interesting, what is tzimukim in Hebrew? Yeah, but what does it usually mean? It usually means raisins. Why is raisins used over here? Because raisins, they're dried up and they're squished tight, okay? So the rains have dried up. They've been, they've shriveled or shrunken is probably a better word than tightened. I don't know why they used tightened. In fact, we actually have this word in Hilchot Shabbat. If a person is making like a chamin on Shabbat and it's fully cooked, the language of halacha is mitztamek v'yafelo. So what happens to your chamin? If you ever cook hamud like on Shabbat, or you overcook it, it starts out really watery and eventually it gets super thick.
Yes.
So that shriveling, that shrinking, it's not tightening. So you see that word tzimuk or nitztamek. All right. They're doing an incredible job. Yesh Shana, says the Gemara. So from that time, when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, the beracha, the openness of the beracha that came to the world dissipated. By the way, this also helps you understand. We read in the Torah about how in Eretz Israel, when the spies went into the land of Israel, they brought out these fruits that were enormous. It took, how many people to carry a thing of grapes, and you think to yourself, how could such a thing be? So he's saying that the rainfall after the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed is incomparable to what it was like before, not only in amount, but also, like we said, in Gishmei Beracha, in how it rained, and how much it rained, and when it rained, etc., etc. Yes. Yesh Shana Shigshmei Mirubin. So you have a year that you have a lot of rain. Yesh Shana Shigshmei Muatin. You don't have so much rain. Yesh Shana Shigshmei Yodim Izmanan. Sometimes you have a year that it falls in the right time. Yesh Shana She'en Gishmei Yodim Izmanan. They don't fall in the right time. Shana Shigshmei Yodim Izmanan Lema Udomeh. When it falls out, the rain in its time, what do you compare it to? Le'evet shenatan lo rabo parnasato be'echad b'Shabbat. You have a servant or a worker, and his master gives him his paycheck. When does he give it to him? He gives it to him on the first day of the week. Okay? So what happens? The guy goes out, he buys everything. When it comes time for Shabbat, everything is as it needs to be. The challah, the thing, the food, akil, everything's great. Okay? Nimtzet isa nefit k'tikna v'nechelet k'tikna. Everything, you bought it early, you made it early, you're eating it properly. What happens? What happens if you don't get it the right time? The Gemara says, he gets paid on Friday. Now he gets paid on Friday. Hadda's running around like a chicken without a head. He can barely get the flour to make the dough, to make the thing, and his bread comes out raw on Shabbat. It's not done properly. Okay? So you can't eat it. It's not proper. It's not. So it's ne'efit shelo k'tikna. It didn't rise. It gets baked the wrong way. It gets eaten the wrong way. So too, when the rain rains in the wrong time, it has a knock-on effect. It's not just that you were anxious until it came, but actually, it's so interesting to me because I like this is such an interesting mashal. You know what I would have said? It's compared to a person who has relations with his wife when she's ovulating, when she's not ovulating. Right, the right time. Person's relations can produce a child. The wrong time, no matter how much relations the guy has, it's not giving him a kid. Right?
Why'd they use that mashal?
It's a weak mashal as compared to, and I'll tell you why. Because we've seen, let me tell you why. I'm not nitpicking on the mashal. We saw already an example in the beginning that rains that come in the wrong time are not just not as good. Rain in the wrong time, what do we call it? Siman. Klala is a curse. So it's not just not as good, it's negative. So this example, the guy is still eating bread. It's just not as fully cooked. It's not as baked, right? But in the example that I was giving, it didn't produce anything at all. And maybe even we have to go further than my example, because in that scenario, it just didn't produce a child, but it didn't do anything negative.
Maybe they're teaching us empathy for people.
Go ahead.
Empathy for the slave, because you pay someone in arrears, not in advance.
Okay.
Right? You typically pay someone after they work a week.
Okay.
Yaakov was paid 7 years after he worked, right?
Yeah, by the biggest trickster in the world, though.
I got it, but you normally pay people.
So we're not actually supposed to do that. There's a mitzvah in the Torah on a day worker. You're not allowed to let the sun set. You got to pay him on the same day.
But this doesn't say it was a day worker. Paid it for the week.
So it's not, and it's an eved, by the way, over here.
Right.
It's an eved. Yeah. So here it's not. Yeah, it doesn't work. Now, what I would have said is, even if you're paying him in arrears, don't pay him on Friday in arrears. Pay him on Sunday in arrears. Because the hard stop is Shabbat. So let's say instead of paying him at the end of the week for Friday, pay him at the end of the week for Sunday. So then he has a whole other week for his money to buy him the things that he needs for Shabbat. Okay? Either way. All right. Let's move on. We actually have to finish now because we have mincha.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just do the last piece. Okay. What happens if you have a year where there's tons and tons of rain? What's it compared to? Where he gives him he pays him for the whole year up front. Turns out the millstones, it's an expression here. When you take a millstone and you grind a core, which is a certain amount of grain, right? You wind up getting the same amount from a much larger amount of grain than you get from a smaller amount of grain. I think what he means here is you get paid a fortune of money. The guy goes out, he buys bling, treats himself to nice restaurants. But what he gets to save out of that large portion is the same as he would have gotten to save out of a much smaller portion. So paying someone in a large amount in one shot is also not beneficial for them. What happens if the rain is very small amount? What's it compared to? When he gives them very, very small. When he gives them very, very small, what happens? Again, what the millstones would grind from a core, they grind from a kav. Why? How come that happens when it's a very small amount? Because each time you have to go to the millstone again to grind. So again, it doesn't produce. You're not in the process of grinding where there's movement in the millstone. Other reasons as well, where again you need to stop and start. It's not as cost effective. In either scenario, again, the guy doesn't get as much as he could have gotten from the core. He gets what he get from a core, what he could have gotten from a kav. Davar acher, another way of understanding this, in a time when there's lots of rain, what's it compared to? A person who's kneading the clay or mixing the cement. If he has a lot of water, the water doesn't get used up, and then what happens? The clay gets used properly. But if he has a very small amount of water, the clay or the cement eats up all the water, and you can't turn it enough for it to kind of develop. So that's what happens when a person has mayim. That's what it's compared to. So the Beit HaMikdash ensured that we got the right amount and at the right time. Rabbi Hananiah ben Akasha Omer.